In the climactic showdown from Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, the audience sees Harry and Voldemort both seek the titular stone. The young wizard seeks it for the purpose of keeping it away from Voldemort, and the Dark Lord seeks it to bring himself fully back to life, and ultimately to overcome death itself. With the help of the Mirror of Erised, Harry discovers that the stone has appeared in his own pocket, and after defeating this year's version of Voldemort, Harry discusses with his wizardly mentor Dumbledore about how the stone came to be in that place. To this, Dumbledore responds that the stone had an enchantment placed upon it that caused the stone to only appear to someone who desired to find it, but not use it. Victory came to young Harry because he did not crave the power of the stone, and it was Voldemort's own craving of the stone's power that kept him from ever getting his hands on it. We see this type of plot device used in a number of stories, often with the idea that the thing desired requires someone with a level of purity or faith in order to wield it, thus denying it to anyone who seeks the thing for nefarious purposes. It's the villain's vile nature that restrains them from their heart's desire, essentially meaning that the villain is the cause of their own undoing. As we grow closer to the end of this Absalom section of David's story arc in the Book of Samuel, we'll see the same type of circumstance. The honor and glory that comes only from God will forever be out of reach of those who vaingloriously grasp at its power. Just as how this whole section started when David grew complacent in the power of being king in Israel, and thus had some of that honor and glory removed from him, so too Absalom's pride in politicking prevent him from being able to attain a lasting royal lineage. And it's only the fact that David continually repents and learns from his mistakes that allows him to regain some of that honor and glory. He might be an example of failure like the other three men whose story arcs we've seen throughout the book, but I believe that the reason why he alone is a forefather of the true hope that brings restoration to God's humble people is because of that repeated repentance and learning from his mistakes. It is to the humble that honor goes. Honor and glory are a part of the restoration that God's chosen king brings to his humble people. And to those who refuse to humble themselves, God will bring humiliation and loss. So obviously this passage will juxtapose David and his son Absalom. David's humility shown through godly grace, and Absalom's pride shown through his royal accoutrement. But before I spoil the whole thing, let's look at the passage beginning with a little bit of the preparation for both sides. 2 Samuel chapter 17, verses 24 to 29. Then David came to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Now Absalom had set Amasa over the army instead of Joab. Amasa was the son of a man named Ithra the Ishmaelite, who had married Abigail the daughter of Nahash, sister of Zeruiah, Joab's mother. And Israel and Absalom encamped in the land of Gilead. When David came to Mahanaim, Shobi the son of Nahash from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir son of Amiel from Lodabar, and Barzillai the Gileadite from Rogelim, brought beds, basins, and earthen vessels, wheat, barley, flour, parched grain, beans, and lentils, honey and curds, and sheep, and cheese from the herd, for David and all the people with him to eat, for they said, the people are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. Let's remember that David, his family, his special forces units, and many of his servants are on the run from Absalom. As well, the prince-turned-usurper king had taken Jerusalem. And because of the terrible counsel from the advisor who was actually a David-aligned mole, Absalom waited to gather a huge army from across Israel so that he could lead the army into battle himself, a prideful overstretch for his own glory. This then allowed David and those with him the chance to cross over the Jordan River and catch their breath. And that catches us up to the passage. Verses 24 to 26 show us the necessary preparations of Absalom. Mainly, this has to do with whom Absalom appointed as general over the army of Israel. There had been an opening in that role since the previous general over the nation's army, Joab, had also happened to be on David's side. And Absalom also had a bit of nepotism for this role. Although, even I'm not sure the exact dimensions of the familial relationship that Amasa was to Absalom, but we'll call them cousins, because Absalom was Joab's cousin, and this passage seems to be saying that Amasa was also Joab's cousin. But regardless, Amasa doesn't take up much more space in this passage than that, so it probably doesn't really matter. The only other bit of preparation that Absalom required was to bring his troops closer to David's. They crossed the Jordan also and make camp in the land of Gilead, probably to send out feelers in order to figure out where the enemy went off to. But David has much more preparation to take care of for his people, first and foremost tending to the weary members of this rushed escape parade. Fortunately, or perhaps better to say blessedly, a motley crew of allies provide shelter and sustenance. In verse 27 we're shown that 3 men came to help out David. The first is a non-Israelite ally from the Ammonites. Not long ago in our time through the book of Samuel, the Ammonites had become vassals of Israel, as God had humiliated them. and so we see at least some among these vassals show kindness to their vassal lord. The second man's name might sound familiar if you remember back in 2 Samuel chapter 9. Amiel from Lo-Debar was a man who had sheltered Mephibosheth, that son of Jonathan, to whom David had shown kindness. Thus Amiel was likely still a supporter of Saul's reign, but had eventually come to join God's choice of David as king. And the final man was Barzillai the Gileadite. Little is known of him except that chapter 19 will later show him to be over 80 years old. So here we have a foreign vassal, a one-time supporter of David's old enemy, and an octogenarian all coming out to aid the fugitive king. There's probably not a more disparate group of individuals all listed together in the entire book. But regardless of the strangeness of their alliance, they bring much-needed supplies, like beds and washing basins, as well as food and drink. The people required sustenance before they could ever think about preparing for battle. The fact that the welfare of the weary was forefront on everyone's mind seems to clue us in on the fact that David was still focusing his efforts on helping those under his leadership. He's focusing on them more than his right to rule, at the very least. In leading his people by providing for them, David proves himself to be the king that they need, even without a throne. There are many leaders without titles or who have given up their role, but through their actions they prove a humble leadership that goes far beyond those who only have a mind for their own glory. It is by such actions that they prove their suitability to lead, even if they don't hold the title. Of course, all of this discussion about David's desire to provide for his people isn't to say that he doesn't eventually make some battle preparations. But even as he prepares for battle, he proves his humility by listening to his people, and he proves kingly grace by his request to his forces. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1-5. Then David mustered the men who were with him and set over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent out the army, 1/3 under the command of Joab, 1/3 under the command of Abishai the son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, and 1/3 under the command of Ittai the Gittite. And the king said to the men, I myself will also go out with you. But the men said, You shall not go out. For if we flee, they will not care about us. If half of us die, they will not care about us. But you are worth 10,000 of us. Therefore it is better that you send us help from the city. The king said to them, Whatever seems best to you I will do. So the king stood at the side of the gate, while all the army marched out by hundreds and by thousands. And the king ordered Joab and Abishai and Ittai, Deal gently for my sake with the young man Absalom. And all the people heard when the king gave orders to all the commanders about Absalom. Likely one of the 3 men from the previous verses had helped David and his people gain access to a city in the area. For certain it would provide protection for the non-combatants among them. And in that city David divided the troops in natural fashion by hundreds and thousands. And in verse 2 we see that David also divided the troops into 3 sections. 1/3 went under the command of Joab, the main general of the army. 1/3 went to Abishai, Joab's brother, who had proven himself a capable general in several previous battles. And 1/3 went to Ittai the Gittite. This last one might surprise us, given the fact that this was a Philistine mercenary. And even more when we remember that in 2 Samuel chapter 15, which wasn't that many days ago in the timeline of events, David had tried to send Ittai and his people back because they had only just recently joined David's command. So basically, David places a newbie foreign mercenary, a Philistine, on equal level with General Joab. Why? Because of Ittai's humble loyalty shown back in chapter 15. His willingness to face the harsh realities ahead side by side with David. Wherever David went, so would Ittai go, even if it meant to his death. Humble loyalty is something to be praised, shown honor, not because the humble person deserves it, but because who better to rely on than the one who bowed the knee to honor you, especially when given the chance to turn away without any repercussions. Someone who chooses the harder path merely because it is the right one. That person is worthy of receiving honor. We witness David doing for Ittai exactly what God does for David in this passage. A humble person who receives honor from God will not just hoard it for themselves, but they will spread that honor, share it with others who have likewise humbled themselves. But not only that, a humble person worthy of honor will also listen to others, even if that counsel opposes their plan. Look at the end of verse 2. David says that he himself will go out with the men. In the Hebrew, the phrasing is emphatic. I myself, I will go out. He has set his mind on this action with complete conviction. In part, I believe, this is in an effort to undo the thing that created this whole mess to begin with. Way back in 2 Samuel chapter 11, David had grown complacent and stayed in his house instead of going off to war with his men. Had he gone out, then he would not have been in the position to lust after Bathsheba. And so, in an effort to prove that his heart had learned his lesson, he attempts to go out to battle with his troops this time. But his men know the truth about how valuable of a target David is. They say that Absalom's troops would value the death of David over the deaths of half the army. The one king would be worth 10,000 soldiers in the eyes of the enemy. For sure, at least Joab had heard Ahithophel's advice to Absalom. While that advice had not been followed, the truth was that a surgical removal of David was the only thing really needed for Absalom to declare victory. Thus, it was best for the entire army to have David safe from a stray arrow or sword strike. And while I am sure that David struggled with their words, he eventually listens to his counsel from his troops. He humbly accepts their advice. Even though everything in him said that it would be far better for him to go, he still stays behind. It takes someone who does not think too much about themselves to listen to others. Even more so to hear how much they are valued in the eyes of others, while not getting a big head about it. But David does give one word of request to his troops as they ready themselves to march out of the city's walls. He asks for grace and mercy to be given to Absalom. David pleads before his entire army, not as a king, but as a father. David pleads with heart wide open that Absalom be dealt with gently, that the men who face Absalom not see an enemy, but rather a son whose father loves him and wants the best for him. Yes, Absalom seeks his father's head, but David longs to once again embrace his erring son. Few would ever call David bloodthirsty if he were to command the death of the one who stole his throne. But that is not what David wants. He calls for mercy and grace in a manner that can only be called reminiscent of God's grace to us granted through the cross. Humility calls for restoration rather than destruction. It doesn't matter how much of an enemy it is that stands before us. We should grant others the same mercy and grace given to us. Also, that restoration of right relationship with God can be granted to that person who sets themselves against God's ways. This includes both of the human beings involved growing more and more like Jesus by following his commands. Such events are impossible if we refuse to humbly seek grace and mercy for others while we show them the truth. Our culture around us teaches us to make an enemy of all who disagree with us. It teaches us that we should destroy and belittle those who hold a position different than we do. It teaches that if we show even the faintest hint of mercy towards those enemies, that we are weak, or worse, secretly in agreement with them. It teaches us that we should humiliate them. But it is not our role to humiliate others. Rather, we should humble ourselves, and let God lead others to whatever level of humiliation that needs to happen. So let us humble ourselves and show grace and mercy to others who have fallen prey to the fallenness of sinful humanity. It is the humility of David that God honors in this passage. Humility that seeks to share the honor with other humble people. Humility that listens to the wisdom of others, even if it goes against our plans. And humility that calls for grace and mercy to be shown to the enemy. This is some of what the humility that God honors looks like. But if we refuse to humble ourselves, then God will lead us to our own humiliation. Loss and defeat is all that can be expected by those who pridefully grasp at honor. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 6 to 8. So the army went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was fought in the forest of Ephraim. And the men of Israel were defeated there by the servants of David. And the loss there was great on that day, 20,000 men. The battle spread over the face of all the country, and the forest devoured more people that day than the sword. Because Absalom chased his father's forces, it was David's men who got to choose the battlefield. And faced with a much larger force, the special forces units following David chose to utilize guerrilla warfare. They chose some area with as much cover as possible and places to hide. The passage calls it a forest, but the general lack of trees in that area of the world today makes us unsure of what exactly is being described here. But whatever this forest was, David's men used it to their advantage. Especially when we see verse 8 say that the forest devoured more warriors than the sword. It was the terrain that did the heavy lifting in this godly victory for David's soldiers. Well, the heavy lifting other than what God provided, which I guess kind of also does include the natural environment, so. Regardless, what God provided was amazing. A complete victory for the men of David. Over 20,000 soldiers of Israel died. That is far more than what Ahithophel had said he'd need to bring with him in his proposed mission from the last sermon. He'd said that he only need 12,000 men. Over 150% of that amount fell before God's appointed king, with an even bigger army behind them. On the one hand, we can cheer for the victory of God and his chosen king. But on the other hand, those fallen soldiers were the countrymen of those who fought against them. They were brothers and cousins, relations that could all be brought back to a single ancestor less than 1,000 years previous. There should be a part of us that mourns for their deaths. Grief like a father who'd lost his son, like a mother who'd lost a daughter. Our hearts should break for destruction that sin has wrought in this world. Both the general fact that death is a consequence of the first human sin, and in the specific sin of Absalom's rebellion, which was caused by so much sin previous, including David's own. Look at the death that sin has wrought. How many people must suffer loss and death because of the effects of our sin? The humiliation of a prideful person often affects many around them, and it should be grieved. But that is not the main focus of this story. No, the total humiliation of one who refused to repent is the focus of the next few verses. 2 Samuel chapter 18, verses 9 to 18. And Absalom happened to meet the servants of David. Absalom was riding on his mule, and the mule went under the thick branches of the great terebinth, and his head caught fast in the oak, and he was suspended between heaven and earth, while the mule that was under him went on. And a certain man saw it and told Joab, Behold, I saw Absalom hanging in an oak. Joab said to the man who told him, What? You saw him? Why then did you not strike him there to the ground? I would have been glad to give you 10 pieces of silver and a belt. But the man said to Joab, Even if I felt in my hand the weight of 1,000 pieces of silver, I would not reach out my hand against the king's son. For in our hearing the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake protect the young man Absalom. On the other hand, if I had dealt treacherously against his life, and there was nothing hidden from the king, then you yourself would have stood aloof. Joab said, I will not waste time like this with you. And he took 3 javelins in his hand and thrust them into the heart of Absalom while he was still alive in the oak. And 10 young men, Joab's armor-bearers, surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Then Joab blew the trumpet, and the troops came back from pursuing Israel, for Joab restrained them. And they took Absalom and threw him into a great pit in the forest, and raised over him a very great heap of stones. And all Israel fled, everyone to his own home. Now Absalom in his lifetime had taken and set up for himself the pillar that is in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. And he called the pillar after his own name, and it is called Absalom's monument to this day. In his pride, Absalom rode into battle facing his father's men. And with even more proof of his arrogance, Absalom refused to remove himself from the symbol of a royal steed. Yes, mules were considered a royal steed at the time. Even when the environment proved to be against the use of a mount, Absalom refused to release that royal symbol. Pride causes us to refuse the release of anything and everything that shows off our puffed-up self-appraisal. It would have been smarter to fight on foot. It's not like fighting on a mount had any advantage in an area where maneuverability was more important than speed. There's a reason why those speeder bikes on the forest moon of Endor and the Return of the Jedi were a bad idea. Boom! Only Absalom's impact did not end with an explosion. No, it ended with his head being caught in a branch. It's not clear if it was his hair that got caught in the trees, or just his head that got caught in something like a fork of the branch, because the word head can refer to the head of hair. Now, considering how much pride Absalom had in his hair, I like to picture that physical representation of his pride being his actual downfall. But either way, his prideful refusal to dismount from his symbol of royalty caused him to be caught unawares by a tree. Caught enough that the mule ran off without him, and he was left hanging on a tree. In this moment of the story, it is clear that Absalom was cursed by God for his sin of prideful rebellion. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 to 23 tells us that anyone who hangs on a tree is cursed by God. Thus, in one swift motion, Absalom went from royally mounted in his pride to cursed in humiliation for his sin. Only it was not because of the tree that he died. No, a soldier on David's side met him hanging in that tree. And having heard David's plea for mercy, that soldier left Absalom alive. Still hanging, sure, but alive. However, he did report it back to Joab. And the general may have his faithful moments, few though they may be, but he was quick to end the life of anyone who opposed him, which is why the general was surprised at this news. You found Absalom and left him alive? How could you do that? Joab even describes a decent reward that he would have given to the one who had killed Absalom. But the nameless soldier showed more faithfulness to the will of the king than the general did. He'd heard David's plea to the three generals. Deal gently with the young man Absalom. Protect him like a father would. Anyone who disregarded the command of the king would not be well rewarded, at least not in a way that they would like. Even if Joab were to have offered 100 times his stated reward, the soldier still would not have lifted a finger against the king's son. And besides, had the soldier done as Joab said he should have, the general would have distanced himself from the soldier's actions, to save face for himself. At this accusation, which I also believe is true, Joab leaves the soldier in a huff, and then went out to the place that Absalom hung from the tree, and with 3 quick strikes to the chest, the general loosed the prince from his wooden captor. Then, just as Absalom's own servants had surrounded and struck Amnon all those years ago, Joab's armor-bearers surrounded Absalom, striking him until he died. Following that horrible disregard for his uncle's command, Joab blew the trumpet signaling to the troops that the job was complete. They should stop fighting against their kin. Apparently, Joab had finally reached his full of blood for the day. When we reach verses 17 and 18, we see the totality of Absalom's legacy. He had wanted the throne, grasped for a royal lineage, but in the end all that he got was a pile of stones heaped on the pit that was his grave, and a monument that he had built himself while he was still alive. Even the 3 sons that 2 Samuel chapter 14 verse 27 said he had seemed to have died, since here in 2 Samuel 18:18 it says that he had no sons. So these 2 piles of stone are the entirety of Absalom's legacy, monuments that testified to his selfish pride and left him with little else, reminders of a man who died grasping for power instead of humbly serving his God. The humble king sought the welfare of those under his command, gave honor to others, listened to them, and sought the same grace and mercy that God had given to him. But the prideful usurper grasped at his throne, led his people to a slaughter, refused to release his symbols of power, and died with only 2 sets of rock to stand as testimony to his foolish grasp for power. It doesn't take a genius to know which side of that equation is the better one. Honor and glory goes to the humble. That's certainly not a promise for an easy life, or that things will always go well for us, but it is a promise that God will share his glory and honor with those who humble themselves to his will, those who repent of their sins, those who learn from their mistakes, and those who seek to be like him. So let's allow the grace and mercy of God to be at the forefront of our minds when we interact with others who oppose God's ways. I'll admit it's difficult to know the exact best way to interact with others who claim to understand some aspect of God, but refuse to follow the totality of his ways. People who cherry-pick specific verses that only support their perspective if taken out of context, and read with a definition of certain terms that they wish to push forward. It's difficult because we want to defend God, fight on his side, but our sinful flesh still wants us to fight with total disregard to that person's value and worth, to disregard the fact that they too are made in the image of God. But the truth is that if we fight in the manner of our sinful flesh, then we are just as sinful as those who stand against God, and we end up destroying more than restoring the way that God desires. Humility seeks restoration, and if we are to join God in his ways, then we must include the grace and mercy that he showed us when we first joined him. And when we do, we'll find that honor and glory will come to us, like a stone that appears in our pocket, not because we sought the power in our pride, but because we sought honor and glory for our God.